Recording in progress.
Francisco was a gentle soul, a dove, a man whose tranquility belied a life filled with much complexity and hardship, but ultimately a life lived with joy. Perhaps it is true that given a little love, maybe all of us humans might have the capacity to become who we believe or wish ourselves to become. This is certainly true of Francisco. He grew up weaving, and one of his design patterns was of a little girl, her arms raised to embrace a flock of doves, sometimes within a circle that symbolized the earth. Francisco, a dove, peaceful, and also an eagle, wise and strong. And now he is gone, suddenly and too soon. We miss him. Our hearts go out to Janice Kimball, Francisco's stepmother, companion, creative collaborator, and business partner of 17 years. The last 5 years as her caregiver also. Let us draw strength and comfort from our gathering here today. The Urzua family had a mass and viewing for Francisco at the Santuario de Nuestra Señora de Guadalupe Church at Seis Corners in Seis Esquinas, come on, Matt, put them together, on September 24. I am grateful to the family for the respect, the kindness, and the generosity shown to Janice during that most difficult of times. Francisco's story will begin with Carol Bauman's interview with Michael Eager. This will give us insight into Francisco's life as an adolescent and teenager. Daria Hilton will provide a profile, or wrote a profile of Francisco that ironically was published in the Ojo del Lago at the time of his death. Daria Hilton authored this Ojo del Lago article that follows after several interviews with Francisco in Spanish. This sensitive profile was a collaboration between just the two of them. Francisco was at the Ajijic Writers Group when she read it aloud. He loved the article and made a small bow. Those who were gathered gave both Daria and Francisco a standing ovation. Now we have reflections from many people close to Francisco. First, let me invite Bob Coaches up to read Carol Bauman's words.
This is Francisco Urzua Ines, The Early Years, an interview with Michael Eager. A peek into Francisco's childhood offers untold stories in the celebration of his life. In the late 70s, Michael Eager, current proprietor of Nueva Posada, met the 10-year-old muchacho while he was constructing the Ajijic real estate facility on Calle Colon. Francisco and his family lived across the street occupying the two front rooms of the building that would later become the Tango restaurant. Teo, Francisco's father, acted as a caretaker in exchange for rent from the Mexico City family who owned the establishment. A master weaver, Teo wove wool ponchos and tapestries on an ancient loom that rested in the foyer. The house's center courtyard served as the community's movie theater, using a portable screen mounted on a truck, and also the location for high-energy cockfights. Michael recalled fond memories of a friendly mentoring relationship that developed between himself and Francisco over a 7-year period. To quote, "I watched Francisco, a quiet child who received little attention, sit on the steps of their house for long periods. One day, Francisco, fascinated by the construction work, bravely walked over to meet me, the foreigner. The boy's smile just lit up the room. The bond between me, 12 years older, and this child of native indigenous heritage formed immediately. I gave him the nickname Panchito as a term of endearment, and Francisco seemed elated to have found an older brother to talk to. He visited often to watch me work, and we engaged in simple conversations that even helped me to practice my Spanish." Excuse me 1 second. I always considered Panchito to be a unique angelito, a term given by the local Mexican people to children or persons who displayed some physical or mental disability, or to those who never married. Panchito, in his way and language, appeared to be suffering, possibly by a minor learning difficulty. I felt comfort for him, knowing that, according to Mexican belief, all angelitos have a guaranteed entrance to heaven, and none of their sins would count against them. Our relationship continued to blossom until 1985, when the family was forced to leave the old Tango building and return to live in Jocotepec. Panchito, a troubled teenager who went astray, just disappeared. I missed the ways he used to spark up my day. We know how this story unfolded. Teo met Janice, and after they started a life together, Francisco returned to live with them. It was Janice who rescued this gentle soul from the abyss. She adopted Francisco and included him in every aspect of her life. Having learned the weaving trade from his father, Francisco became a master weaver in his own right. Michael remembered the day Panchito came to tell him the greatest news. He knew his acceptance was complete when Janice allowed him to drive her car. I told Michael that I had seen Francisco the day before his passing. Despite having been ill a week earlier, he appeared in good health, beaming and happy. Michael summed it up perfectly. He was an angelito to the end. In blurring of pagan and Catholic beliefs, God was helping Panchito rally before his death, preparing him for what was to come and allowing those who loved him to remember him with his wonderful spirit and his infectious smile. Thank you.
We will now hear from Dario Hilton.
I am the world's worst public speaker, but for Francisco, I'm up here. So this little piece is an introduction to the profile that I did. And Janice asked me to write a little bit about the process because she really enjoyed watching Francisco and I chit chat, and she hadn't seen him laugh like that in a bit, you know, so it was a good time. I went there twice, but let me go on. So I remember the first time I saw Francisco. It was January 2017. Donald Trump had just been elected, and a worldwide protest and women's march had been organized. Ahihik's march started in the plaza with several speeches. One speaker was an older, fiery woman who needed some assistance navigating the stage. Her helper was a young Mexican man with a gentle and protective manner. This dynamic duo was, of course, Janice Kimball and her stepson, Francisco Urzua. I would run into this pair often as I joined the Ahihik Writers Group, of which Janice was a member. I came to know Janice as a passionate activist, artist, and writer. I later discovered Francisco's talent for weaving and his admiration for the design skills of his stepmom. I jumped at the chance to write a profile of Francisco for El Ojo del Lago, as I knew little else about him beyond his role as Janice's helper and artistic collaborator. I believe the idea was hatched at La Bodega, the same night Francisco stepped out of his comfort zone and onto the dance floor with me and my two left feet. I realized that night that Francisco was also ready to step out of the shadow of Janice's larger-than-life presence. When I arrived at their weaving studio for the first of two interviews, it wasn't one of the intricate, brilliantly colored pieces that Francisco brought to my attention. He proudly showed me a small, maybe 8 by 10, framed and faded camel-colored weaving with dozens of short, slightly darker lines which formed an upside-down U. It is the Virgin of Guadalupe, he explained to me in his limited English. Then I could see it. The lines mimicked the sun rays that surround the Virgin in her classic representation. The center of the weaving was empty, but where I saw space, he saw the heavens. This was the first of many glimpses I would get into Francisco's artistic soul. Neither of the interviews were formal, we just talked. I asked a few questions and let Francisco talk story. I learned of crushes he had as a young man and his excitement over being allowed to drive a pickup truck on the back roads of far northern California when he was a teenager. He snickered about his once nickname, Garbanzo, based on the color of his skin. He never spoke directly about his mental health struggles. He recalled jumping into a violent ocean for a swim years ago at the behest of some uncontrollable thoughts. He almost drowned, but looking back, he simply concluded, that was a bad decision. Francisco walked an incomparable path on this earth, one with pitfalls, strange twists, and glorious vistas. And though I only walked a tiny stretch of it with him, his grace, courage, and full heart will reside with me always. Thank you.
So now Carol will come up, Carol Bradley, and read Dario's article in the Ojo del Lago.
I know that there's a little bit missing out of this, so I'm going to read from here.
Fine, yes.
I'm Carol Bradley. I apologize for the mask. I got a bit of a cough, but I wouldn't miss this for anything. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to read Daria's published article that was published in the Ojo del Lago in October. Many of the exact details of the first 40 years of Francisco Ozuna's life are sharp in his mind, but mental health struggles have scrambled their order and lent significance to them in a haphazard manner. The thread that runs through all the multi-hued shards of memory is the understanding that weaving stills his mind and helps bring together his disparate thoughts. Francisco's weavings, designed by his stepmother, Janice Kimball, explore color, abstract, and nature-based patterns and prehistoric themes. In a technical sense, they are difficult pieces. They demand the precision and focus of a master weaver. The wonder of Francisco's talent is it unequivocally asserts itself, whether his mind is clear or a tempest. Life-changing medication allows Francisco both his genius and the capacity to deal with everyday details of running his life and business. This wasn't always his fate. Francisco was born in Jocotepac in 1968, the first son and second child of a large family that would eventually include 13 children. His father, Teo, was a weaver and opal miner. His mother, Maria del Refugio, a devout Catholic who considered her children gifts from God. When Francisco was very young, his father struck it rich in the opal business and moved the family to Ajijic, where he set up a weaving factory. Here, Francisco learned the family trade, working alongside a half-dozen professional weavers. Sadly, the success of the factory was short-lived, and the entire family found themselves scrambling for both a place to live and livelihoods. The years that followed were tough for everyone. A dreamer, Teo started businesses that inevitably failed and spent largely unfruitful years in pursuit of the next big break. The tumult of these times led to the separation of Francisco's parents and the scattering of his siblings. As a young teen, Francisco went to the United States in pursuit of work. And although he found gainful employment, his mental health began to erode. There were many trips back and forth across the border, successful stretches in which Francisco held down jobs in agriculture, but also months on end where he was literally lost. During one stint, which may have been as long as 2 years, Francisco hopped the wrong train and ended up hopping train after train, trying to find his way back to Guadalajara. He chuckles about it now, but his family was convinced he had died. It was either chance or a guardian angel that led him back home. This wandering dreamtime life might have gone on indefinitely if his father hadn't met Janice Kimball. Teo and Janice met through a mutual friend, and although it might not have been a match made in heaven, they spent some good years together. Janice didn't know what to make of Teo's son Francisco, but understood mental health issues better than his father and offered whatever stability she could. Francisco eventually moved in with his father and Janice, living initially on the roof in a makeshift room with a discarded plastic kiddie pool propped up on chairs for shelter. In his mind, this was better than the abandoned copper mine he had been living in. One fateful day when Teo was out of town, Francisco stepped up to an unfinished weaving his father had left on the loom and started working it. Janice was dumbfounded. She had no idea her stepson could weave, much less complete a rather complicated pattern. She scraped together the money for a second loom and was delighted to learn that Francisco's talent exceeded his father's. The three of them spent a few productive years together, but the personality clash between Janice and Teo escalated to the point where they separated. Francisco, by now a cherished son, stayed on. The partnership between stepmom and stepson grew. Soy más feliz cuando soy laborioso. Laborioso, gracias. I am most happy when I work hard and on work that is intense, Francisco admits. There is perhaps a universal truth in this. Meaningful work brings rise to an incomparable inner peace. Though he considers himself to be blessed to be able to create these amazing works, it is our community, indeed the world, that benefits from Francisco's efforts. We are not only gifted with his weavings, but also the story of his inspiring life journey. In the words of his namesake, Saint Francis of Assisi, when you leave this earth, you can take with you nothing that you have received, only what you have given, a full heart enriched by honest service, love, sacrifice, and courage.
Janice Kimball will now offer some words.
Hello, everybody. I'm just so grateful. I don't know how I would have gotten through this without all of you. Francisco Urzua Ines, the light of my life, died from an asthma attack. It was fast and he did not suffer. It was a heartening surprise that my shy companion was so recognized and loved in our community. Francisco had been my life for 17 years. When his father, Teo, and I separated 12 years ago, Francisco was disabled because of schizophrenia. He was living with us. "Do I have to leave too?" he asked me. We paid the psychiatrist in custom-woven horse blankets. Every day, Francisco thanked me when he took his medication. The screams for help that tormented him day and night stopped. I taught him to drive, to not be afraid of the telephone or animals. It must be 5 years now since he was the one who took care of me. We've never said an unkind word to each other and never tried to change each other. He was very much my son, and it was a joy seeing him come into full bloom after a hard life. Every day there were hugs. Every day we spoke of how lucky we were to have each other. I am not left with not one regret. Francisco and I had a symbiotic relationship, that is true. But it was a relationship built on trust and choice, never on need. He was at his best in every way the day he died. His leaving followed a wonderful day spent at Fiesta, followed that evening by listening to music before our lit fireplace on the Mirador. He filled my heart to overflowing with such an abundance that it will see me through this final chapter of my life without him. The story of the trials and triumphs of Francisco Urzua Ines during the years we spent together began in the first gallery that his father Teo and I rented on 10 Septiembre in Ajijic. After his days hanging out and sweeping the plaza, Francisco slept there at night, and he would be gone before we relieved to find our card work and artwork in a different arrangement in the morning than we left it that night. I spoke almost no Spanish then, and information about him was not forthcoming. I never heard him speak, and I wondered if he was mute. He was like a phantom to me the year before I bought what was initially a party place in Rancho del Oro. Teo and I lived in one room the 6 months before we were able to start construction. Teo set up his loom under an awning outside, and we displayed the weavings in the front yard. During that time, Francisco was apprehended for being disruptive on the plaza and sent to CRIAD, a shelter and rehabilitation center for alcohol addiction. On our visits, I came to know him as the fine, honorable man that was so obvious once others came to know him. He was proclaimed cured and released a year later. His father thought it best he no longer spent days on the plaza and took him to his abandoned copper mining shaft on a mountainside above San Juan Cosala to live. We visited him during the week and took him food and provisions, and he spent the day with us on Sundays, where he said the howl of wolves in the short distance frightened him, and that he had to keep a fire going all night. He would shower and have a home-cooked meal. Our hearts cried for him, but at the time, it seemed that there were no other options.
Now we'll have a reflection by Paul Bennett, which will be read by Bob Coaches.
These are stories Francisco shared with Paul while he visited and worked with him when he lived in his mountainside cave. Francisco had decided to leave the rehabilitation center where he had been for a year, battling the temptations of alcohol. He went to live in a mineshaft cave on the mountainside where the carretera curled by the row of San Juan Cosala restaurants. He was excited about the mining prospects, perhaps finding gold. His father Teo had once very successfully mining opals in the Magdalena area. As Paul helped Francisco carve steps into the mountainside, he told him about his life. In his mid-teens, he had illegally crossed into the U.S. and traveled around by jumping trains like a hobo. Sometimes he climbed onto a freight train not knowing its destination. He was always looking for work. For a while, he worked for an old Chinese man who produced shiitake mushrooms. In another frightening incident that he was told about later, Francisco hopped a train north of the border. It was a hot day atop a metal railroad car, and after many hours, he had not eaten for days and was dehydrated. When the train slowed down to navigate a turn in Mexico's high Sierras, he hopped off, weak, and believing his luck for finding water would be better on the other side of the mountain, he entered a railroad tunnel. Halfway through, he heard the engine of a train approaching and flattened himself against the wall. He was terrified, and the train missed him by inches. When reaching the other side of the tunnel, he passed out. A Cora Indian found him. It took weeks before his family nursed Francisco back to health. One day, when they were gone, he walked off and eventually found himself in Tepec. He doesn't remember how he got there, but was plagued with guilt and shame. He never said goodbye nor thanked the Coras for who saved him. During this time, his family had no idea where he was. He self-medicated with alcohol. He had a shy smile and would laugh as he recalled some of the foolish things he did. For a while, when he finally met up with his family in Puerto Vallarta, he was a bell ringer for the Gold Dome Cathedral. Every week, Francisco left his mountain domain to visit Janice and Teo in West Ajijic and take a shower. In September of 2007, in San Juan Cosala, a tornado waterspout produced a tremendous mudslide. The mountainside where the deluge hit was where Francisco's cave was located. He managed to get out, and Janice gave him refuge on the top of her home. She didn't know that Francisco was a weaver. One day, she found him operating her loom, a lovely surprise. From then on, they worked together. Janice provided medication for Francisco, and he helped her as her mobility decreased. The house was remodeled, pets collected, and a unique, devoted partnership flourished. Thank you.
Now Lynn Cleek will read additional words by Janice Kimball.
Gracias. After the Trumba's devastation, a single bed on the roof with an inverted plastic swimming pool as shelter is where Francisco took up residence. He loved his spot. You would think he was living at the Ritz-Carlton after moving with his stepmother and his father, Teo. While Janice supervised the construction crew from Six Corners and made weaving patterns, and while Teo weaved, Francisco daydreamed and made almost daily trips pedaling to Jocotepec and back on a borrowed bicycle. Janice drew up blueprints and the construction of a home and gallery began. But her plans, as well as her vision, were, one might recall, were out of the ordinary. At first, her construction maestro from Six Corners and his crew gave her a hard time, but she continued to add on year after year. When it was learned that their family of three, as well as the construction, were the source of local jokes, Francisco got very angry. Those times have passed, but Janice still recalls that it was the only time she saw Francisco with a snarl on his face. One day, Teo had to be gone for a few days. Francisco and she were munching on tacos when, in the shock of her life, Francisco walked up to Teo's loom, stepped up on the pedals, and began weaving. She had no idea he could weave. It was a very complex pattern, the second of a pair of seated Mayan philosophers not yet half done. She was awestruck to see the swiftness and sureness of his fingers, their dexterity when rounding corners. An hour later, she came to know that really he was a better weaver than his dad, possibly the best weaver on a primitive two-harness loom she had ever seen. Francisco's compadre in Jocotepec, Roberto, had an extra loom. There's a picture of it in the back of Janice's pickup truck before they brought the loom back to the gallery as a surprise for Francisco. It was in need of some adjustments and repairs before setting it up under an awning in the front yard. Francisco was so excited he could not contain himself and jumped up and down in glee. In an effort to have a controllable environment to live under during the construction above them, to their great good fortune and to the recommendation of friends, Sharon and Norman, they hired Fernando Anaya, who was to become the solver of many of their problems, as well as an extended family member. There is a picture of Fernando nailing up papel picado as celebration for a half bath being added onto the summer kitchen. Fernando was to become Francisco's most trusted friend. Soon after that, Janice's son Terry, from a group home in Detroit, began to visit for extended periods of time. It might seem that there would be rivalries and not a small amount of jealousy between the stepbrothers. But the opposite happened. They bonded immediately, Francisco taking on the role as caretaker. The affection between them could be felt by most all who saw them together. In celebration, they adopted Isabella the cat. Putting a loom on the roof was not one of Janice's better decisions. Fernando and Francisco carried the parts up bit by bit, 2.5 flights of stairs, and reassembled it. What Janice hadn't realized was that it would be so windy up there, or that when Teo from Jocotepec came to help Francisco to rewarp it, a two-man, two-day job, and he was terrified of heights. So, guess what? A few weeks later, the loom had to be brought back down the stairs, reassembled, rewarped. It was amazing the lengths the two men went to in order to please Janice, and without one word of complaint. Adopting a parrot to occupy her ornate cage was even a better decision. The saga of Max the bird lasted 12 glorious years. Here is a picture of Teo, maybe there's a picture, feeding him soon after Janice brought him home. No pictures, huh? Max, in his kindergarten years, loved to groom Teo's mustache, yet at first he was prone to bite when others came near him. He was one spoiled bird, let me tell you, and demanded to be hand-fed his porridge. After Teo took his sombrero off the loom for the last time, Francisco refused to handle Max, who screeched like bloody murder that first night in his cage in the courtyard. Francisco spent that night in a chair beside his cage and talked to him. The next morning, they were friends, and soon they were hanging out together. When Max matured, he was made the publicity director of Aztec Studios. He even had his own newsletter. Max brought youth and vigor to the studio. He ate the sponge handle on Janice's cane one day and died too soon. So he's still being missed today. Precious was a disgruntled miniature poodle mix. She had been rescued from a puppy mill and had some miles on her, truthfully. Francisco, who had never had a pet other than his kitten, Isabella, protested when Janice insisted he get a dog to keep him company when she left to visit her family in Detroit. Finally, pressured to compliance, Francisco caved in. Janice went along with Francisco's belief that the tiny white dog was just an innocent youngster. Oh, here's a picture. Even when she was blind and almost toothless and died with dementia at the age of 14, but the vet said she was at least 18, she was still Francisco's baby girl. When Precious Pooch wasn't in the mood for his cuddling, she snubbed him, but he hugged her anyway. He didn't care. However, he became his constant companion and was there to supervise the remodelings after the initial construction of their home and gallery were complete. When they got another feline, Pedro, to keep Isabella company, he too fell in love with Precious and her temperamental ways. Among the photographs we are not seeing, oh look, there's Precious. Are those when Janice marched in the annual parade for the celebration of Señor del Uaje in Jocotepec. Precious sat on her lap. I don't know if you can see her in there or not. Precious, the dog may be up front and Janice might be behind her.
I was holding her.
She was holding her, so all we got was a picture of the dog. The other members, she was pushed along with all the other members of the Union of Weavers of Jocotepec, of which she was the only female, as well as the only gringa in the parade. At least half a mile later, the pneumatic wheels of her wheelchair, by then flattened, they reached the church of Señor Uaje, the patron of the ancient Catholic temple in Jocotepec. And there, I think you can see it up in front. They wondered how the padre of the temple would react when they followed the marchers into the church, but he just gave them a wink and the widest of smiles ever. When Janice would stop believing in herself as a writer, Jim would come over. It was at these times that he and Francisco became trusted friends. When Jim was dying of cancer, he had a bevy of women caretakers to make sure he ate nothing but the meager offerings of vegetables the doctors prescribed. When his days were numbered, he called Francisco to smuggle him in a roasted chicken from Soriana, which of course Francisco did. With a rage to live and nothing to lose, Jim hired a taxi to take him to a holistic clinic in Ajijic. He called and asked Francisco to meet him there to make sure he understood the doctor's Spanish. There were no options left for him, the doctor told him, unless you can find a rattlesnake and eat the shaker. Well, Jesus from the corner grocery found one and brought it back from Ocotlan. It was gutted and lacked a head. Francisco helped him drink pulverized rattler, stirred into a glass of water. Doesn't that sound appetizing? Seemingly restored, Jim got out of bed afterwards, waved goodbye from his front door, but he was just a really good actor.
And now we have a reading from Alan McGregor, which, okay, Lorna is going to read this.
I'm Lorna Dean, and I'm going to read for Alan McGregor, since he's unable to be here this afternoon. And bear in mind, I haven't seen the text before. When the shocking news of the passing of Weaver, Maestro Francisco Urzua reached me, I was deeply saddened by the loss, not only for me as a friend, but for Mexican arts, and especially the woven arts. My respect for the imagination and originality of the collaboration between Francisco and Janice increased steadily over the years. By 2018, I was moved to ask them if I could create a photo blog to introduce them to a wider audience. The following introduction to that blog gives only a hint of the respect and affection I have for them. I have felt privileged to be in their presence, photographing while they co-create what could be the beginning of a new wave in Mexican weaving. The fact that Francisco can turn Janice's very non-traditional free-form designs into stunning works of abstract fiber art on ancient looms confounds me. Watching him is akin to hearing a very talented jazz musician transform a traditional melody into something familiar and yet utterly new. Together, they are masters of rhythm in execution and in visual results, collaborating at a level at which they become one creator.
You might as well stay up.
Yeah. Now I'm going to read my part of the service. Janice was hospitalized 3 times at various hospitals, mostly for heart surgery, so Francisco and I spent a lot of time together at the hospitals. I would have had a lot of difficulty without Francisco in Spanish-speaking Guadalajara hospitals. Francisco was a wonderful caregiver to her. He paid attention to the doctor's instructions diligently and always brought Janice her prescriptions at the proper time. He made it easy to manage her wheelchair and take her on outings. During one of Janice's hospital stays, Francisco went home and found her will. Then Janice and I revised it with the assistance of an attorney and notario who came to the San Antonio hospital for her to sign it. The entire point of this revision was to ensure that Francisco had a secure home in the event of Janice's death. It never once occurred to us to plan for Francisco dying first. Francisco would pick me up and take me home various times I went to visit Janice. Many times he would ring my doorbell and I'd find him outside with gifts of flowers or one of his homemade meals. I helped with Janice and Francisco's exhibitions and open houses to display and sell their weavings. For this, they gave me the title of gallery director, complete with a name tag that they insisted I wear. A title I always felt was rather generous considering what I actually did, which was take money from customers. A year ago, Francisco wanted a credit card machine for the weaving business, a frustrating and extremely complicated process. Francisco and I went to the bank and the accountant together, but he deliberately diligently learned how to use the credit card machine, report to the accountant each month, and even went to license the business with the tax office in Guadalajara without my help. After that, he became very self-assured and became perhaps the main decision maker in the collaboration of Janice and Francisco. I have 2 of their weavings at home, and I think of Francisco every time I look at them.
Bob Coaches will now offer his own words.
There are many stories you will hear or have heard about the sweet man gone before his time. I would like to tell you a couple, those relating to our UU Fellowship. We all know he came and he made the coffee, but not many of you know he was a founding member of the Hospitality Committee. We would meet once a month to talk about circle suppers, fellowship lunches, and what was happening in our lives. The criteria for membership in the committee was simple. Who would we all like to get together to have breakfast with once a month? That is how much I thought of him. Another side of Francisco was his love of music. He joined the UU choir and was one of the most enthusiastic members. He never missed a practice, sang with gusto, and practiced, and practiced. He was always there smiling, hanging on every word of instruction. He was always worried he was not good enough for us, but he was the example and the inspiration of what a member should be. I will miss this kind, sweet man with all my love and tears. Rest in peace, my friend.
Let me invite Christy Caldwell to say a few words, and then she will read a poem by Bill Freyer.
Hi, everyone. As a certified ESL teacher, I had the pleasure of being Francisco's last English teacher during 21 and 2022. Our 90-minute classes were delightfully fun, and he was a good and devoted student. When I arrived for his lesson, Francisco was invariably at the loom, and he was proudly showing me their latest work of art. Then he would lead me to the kitchen where all of his materials and sometimes his homework was laid out in a row, always with a glass of juice or water for me. One lesson after we had finished all the grammar stuff, we were learning the names of emotions and feelings, and I asked him to tell me about a time when he was really, really embarrassed. And he told me when he was about 13 or 14, he was playing in a very important soccer match in Ajijic. And he was running down the field and he saw a girl that he had a crush on in the stands. So he decided to show off with some fancy footwork, and he accidentally kicked the ball into the opponent's goal. We had a good laugh about that when they carried him off the field on their shoulders. Again, after finishing our grammar drills, we always had free-range discussions about pop culture and music, which he loved. And I'm a musician, so he would always ask me about how to sing. I never got a chance to hear him sing, but I'm sure he's singing somewhere right now. And I said to him, well, who do you think is the most beautiful woman in the world? Imagining he would say an actress. Got up and went into Janice's office where she was at her computer and kissed her on the forehead and said, this is the most beautiful woman in the world. He and Janice led me here to the UU Fellowship and I'm grateful that I was part of Francisco's life for an all too brief time. I'll miss him. This is by Bill Freyer, who apparently is not here today, so I'm going to read in his absence. The following poem was published in 2009 in the book Agave Blood, Poems by Bill Freyer. About 14 years ago, he and Francisco began a friendship. Bill, born in Philadelphia, came over on Saturdays to help Francisco with his English studies. When he moved back to the United States, Francisco wove him a banner bearing the name of the city of Bill's birth as a going-away present. I think there was a picture of him holding a sign, Philadelphia. Francisco, he silently stands to weave the unclaimed threads of deep color into a tapestry of love, basking in the love of those who accept his demons and understand how his art can speak to his unreachable parts. Thanks.
And now Loretta Downs will offer words on death in Mexico and Francisco.
Boy, counting our blessings, they're two big ones. We're all born with death holding our hand. We're built for our bodies to be emptied of our souls and our consciousness. Death is the source of love of life in the Mexican community. Reminders of death are ubiquitous in their abundance in art and design. They're everywhere here. Mexicans play with her, and they dance with her instead of arguing with her like we Anglos do. It's believed that loved ones return to visit the ofrendas lovingly drawn by the urgent fragrance of the golden cempasúchil, enticed by favorite food and drinks, and loved ones keeping their memory alive. That's why the years that Francisco was alive were lived with gratitude. He understood that his life was a life of great wealth. Francisco accepted that his body would not go on forever. He understood that the love that filled him, the friends that will always be able to feel his light, embrace, or see him smiling behind the coffee urn, and the extensive artistic work he left behind, would be the vehicle which he would travel through eternity and bring him back on the Day of the Dead to sip Coke and eat popcorn with us. And if you didn't notice the ofrenda that was in the plaza, every day a little less Coke was in that bottle. And a few fewer kernels of popcorn in the bowl. Eternity.
And now let me invite John Dodds to read his poem, Strands of Life. Welcome, John.
Thank you. Well, working with Janice on the anthology of Bravado, I had the pleasure of Francisco's company on a regular trip to their studio. It was a good feeling every time I stopped to watch him work the loom, or just pass by with a friendly smile, which he always seemed to have. That and reading Three in a Cage provided the impetus for these few words of remembrance. Maestro Francisco was himself a tapestry loom, a weaver of life's strands, shedding, picking, and battening on the treadles in silence. In sync with the rising and falling overhead heddles, as the shuttles danced through the warp, he wove a tapestry of dreams and love. The memory of the maestro art remains a faint tinkling, danced through the warp. He wove a tapestry of dreams and loves. Oops, I slipped it. The memory of the maestro's art remains a faint tinkling from the spool as the yarn of time in my life slowly dwindles. I had the pleasure of the weaver's company. Though all too brief, he will always be bending over the treadle's loom, intricate warp. In a symphony of threads, a musician, taking strands of fiber, linking in the next, playing the ancient two-harness apparatus. Like a violin or a piano player pumping pedals, creating a tapestry of woven beauty, always with a gentle grace and a warm smile. Thank you.
Now Janice Kimball will offer some final words.
Thank you. The ancient family loom was prepared to help create one more weaving. And as each time before, we were excited about embarking on the journey of again giving birth. But instead, a little more than a week later, Francisco was gone, and so was the loom. His uncle from Acotepec has it now, and its life will continue. The passing of Francisco left a huge void, and yet through my new caretaker's smiles, Lola's over there, my new caretaker, I feel the warmth and love he left behind. I had absolutely no idea how much he spoiled me, how he catered to my every need. I had no idea how many others it would take to replace the amount of things he did for me. Francisco was at my side for 17 years. I was in my elder years when he became my son and I became his mother. He radiated a pure love that I had not known existed. He healed my wounds. I healed his. Somewhere over the rainbow, I imagine that his father Teo, Max Bird, Elliot, Pedro, and Isabella Felines will be thrilled to see him. It is not my time yet to join them. I am one lucky woman and will cherish the memory of this beautiful man and try to be a credit to the goodness he left behind. Thank you.
We have a little slideshow. Yes, there we go.
Chimney tops, that's where you'll find me. Somewhere over the rainbow fly over the rainbow, whiter, white can't if happy little bluebirds fly beyond the rainbow, why, oh, why can't
As a closing blessing, I invite you to rise in body or spirit as you are able, and join hands with those beside you. And for those of you who are joining us remotely, please join in this blessing with your spirit. Hands touch hands. These hands you hold now once touched Francisco's hands. And hand by hand, we touch those who are here with us and those who are no longer with us. And hand over hand, we touch all of humanity. Let our hands, touching hands, remind us. Francisco is no longer with us, but he is in us. He touched us. He is in our remembrances. He is in our stories. He is in the way we move through the world. Let us go in peace and joyfully join hands Francisco with us in our hearts. May it be so. Viva Francisco! Sí, claro. So this concludes our celebration of life from Francisco. However, we invite you to stay for snacks and drinks and conversation. And Janice has also prepared a book of our service today as a gift for those who came to celebrate Francisco's life. They'll be on a table out in the reception area. Please take a copy before leaving.